Joseb Gim. It's spelled J-O-S-E-B. My last name is not the common spelling, which is K-I-M, but G-I-M. And that's obviously because my father decided that he was going to spell it a different way, and that's pretty much how he's always lived his life. Even my first name, as you know, Koreans can't pronounce the F sound, so rather than writing a PH or an F, he wrote Joseph, which is J-O-S-E-B. Now, the last spelling of my name, G-I-M, also, because it's not Kim, it's Gim, right? So that's how he spelled my first name out, which is great. I take a lot of pride in it now, but growing up it was very difficult because, you know, J-O-S-E-B doesn't sound like Joseph, it doesn't look like Joseph, and I was actually born in Baltimore, and I grew up in Maryland. I went to an all-black school since until second grade, and then afterwards we moved into the suburb area. And when we were in the suburb area, it was like half black, half white, and you know, not many Asians around when I was growing up. So being different was very, very different. And not to mention the fact that my father actually gave me a bowl cut when I was growing up. So I had like a full bowl cut head of hair. And the irony of the whole thing is that I didn't experience racism when I was going to an all-black school. The first time I experienced racism was when I moved to the suburbs.
When you went to the good neighborhood.
Exactly. And then there were, you know, white folks and black folks, and, you know, what do we do with you? You know, and like Karate Kid came out when I was in elementary school. It was the worst experience of my life. And you know what? My dad never let us go to the movies. The best thing about it was, I didn't see it until years later, and then I was so upset because I didn't realize that Ralph Macchio, the main character, was a white guy, and I was like, why are you making fun of me? What does that have to do with me? With that name, J-O-S-E-B, I was getting all kinds of different pronunciations for my name. It was Joseb, Jose-B, yes, exactly. So it was, now everyone calls me Joe, that's pretty much what I go by. But, you know, growing up it was certainly different. But that name, I think, has stuck with me, and the fact that my father chose to do things another way and chose to make a decision based on what he thought was the right way of doing things, I think that's played out through his life and also fed into mine. So my father, Jacob, you spelled his name correctly, he was born during the Japanese occupation. He's in his 70s now. I'm 33. He, at a very young age, he was the oldest of a family where he had older sisters. He was the oldest son. He had a younger brother, but he actually became the head of his household at the age of 12 because his father was executed for being a communist sympathizer when he was very young. So at that point, my father swore that he was going to become a prosecutor and avenge his father's death. And, you know, he started to get very good grades. He did very well in high school. And then afterwards, he took the bar exam, which, as you know, in Korea, you can take the bar exam right out of school. There's no prerequisites to taking the bar exam. And he actually did quite well. He passed the first part of the bar exam, and the second part of the bar exam he failed. Well, he ended up taking the bar exam 13 times and never passing. There were some stints along the way where he went back to law school. He actually did graduate from that, and some of his friends became very prominent lawyers. But he was taking it at a time when he had no money, and also where you know, he was a little bit older than everyone else taking it because he had tried to pass the exam. He had a sense of urgency to become a prosecutor as soon as possible. After that, he ended up meeting my mother and deciding to change his career path and to come to the United States. Now, my mother had come to the U.S. because her older sister had married a U.S. serviceman. So then he comes a few years afterwards, and he came to the United States and decided that he was going to become actually a painter. That was his original plan. He was going to paint landscapes. But my uncle, the serviceman, came up to him and said, no, no, no. You're going to go out and you're going to get a job doing anything. You're not going to be a painter. You're going to become, you know, go work at McDonald's, whatever it may be. So my father did that. He started working 3 different jobs, and his whole hope was to, you know, start a family here in America. And his goal also was to hopefully bring, you know, his family members in Korea to the United States and say, look, you know, that dream didn't work out, but this one might. But the fact that he couldn't become a prosecutor became his haunt. And that weighed with him through his whole life. When he first came to the United States, my mother was attending a very affluent church of other Korean Americans, and there were doctors and lawyers, and it was a picnic service where they had decided to have a fishing competition. Some people had boats, everyone had their nice rods and reels. They put their, they were going out there and they were going to win it. Now my dad, who had just come to the country, didn't have a penny in his pocket. He asked to borrow some fishing wire and a hook. He made a rod from a stick that he found walking around, and he used all the knowledge that he had from when he was a kid, having to scrap and having to do things on his own and be resourceful. And he won the competition. He got the biggest fish. Yeah. And all the doctors and lawyers are like, who is this guy? And he's like standing there with his big fish. He's like, this is how you do it, fellas. And that's my dad. Like, no matter what, no matter where you put him, he's going to be able to claw his way out and be able to make something of it. And that's something that really can't be taught. It has to be earned. And it's something that, I'm sure that looking back on it, like, he wouldn't have wanted for himself, but ended up being his greatest strength and was ultimately something that I was able to carry on into my own life. So he owned a store. He purchased a store in Baltimore. It was one of the worst neighborhoods in Baltimore. Bulletproof glass, the whole thing. And I was 3 years old at the time. My older sister was 5 years old at the time. And we had just bought this was his first store, so we were there during the week while he was learning the business for the first couple of weeks after he had purchased it. And one day, after hours, after we had closed up the shop, we were all there. I remember distinctly, I was complaining about the ice cream because, all of a sudden we had this store where I could eat anything in it. And all I was focused on was the ice cream. And my father was actually shot in the back of the store. Someone had come to the store to kill my father. So he was shot, I was there, my sister was there, my mother were there, we were all there. He was shot in the stomach. He survived.
No warnings, no nothing?
No warnings, no nothing. Later on, we came to theorize, my father suspects that the previous owner might have known that this was the case, but what had actually happened was a rival corner store owner who was not Korean wanted to purchase the store, but was not allowed into part of the bidding practice. Now, for him, the reason why a Korean would sell to another Korean is not because they don't want to sell to someone else. It's because, God knows how the books look, like, is anyone doing the inspections, like, that's why you would sell to another Korean. But then there's the other side of the coin where these people are like, oh, well, Koreans only sell to Koreans.
They just interpret it a very different way.
Exactly. So
They
he had
just
hired...
miss me kind of thing.
He had hired someone to kill my father. He survives. The person who shot him was arrested. The person who hired him was also arrested. I remember distinctly visiting my father with my mother and my sister, like while he's, recovering, and my father just flipping out on my mother. And this was his spirit. Like, even in his deathbed, he's like, you think you don't need me? You think you can run the store without me? And he's like, that was his spirit. He was just constantly like ready to jump out of his body. His body was not going to hold him back from accomplishing what he had to accomplish. There was never a moment in his life when he was lying down that his will was not active in every part of what he did. And that was my father. My father had always wanted me to become a judge, because in Korea you can become a judge right out of law school. But I said, that's not for me. I don't want to study for forever. It's just not my thing. But at the same time, in my household, my father's a very strong man of faith. We always went to church. I always wore a suit. I read the Bible a lot with the family, and we were always talking about things involving justice and just having a concern for helping people. That's also something that my dad always did. So when those pillars were sort of there, it was kind of natural for me to just end up in law school, because I was just taught to think at a very young age, to be critical. Like, I was always encouraged to think by my parents. And then once I went to law school, like, what are you going to do afterwards? I went to Fordham Law School, which has a huge focus on public service and public interest. And then when I was there, you know, I did meet prosecutors, and I was like, you know what?
That's me.
This fits. It just fit. And even the fact that I ended up in Staten Island, so I was actually hired by the Staten Island DA's office, which a lot of people don't know Staten Island as a DA's office, but a new DA had just come in, Dan Donovan, and he wanted to get a diverse body of people. So I was actually the first Korean American ever hired in the office. And he's succeeded. Like, he's always concentrated on bringing diversity to the office, which is ironic because he's the only Republican DA in the 5 boroughs. And, you know, he actually, percentage-wise, does a much better job than a lot of other folks to get their staff to be minorities. So then I was hired as a DA, and when I was sworn in, you know, nothing beat the fact that my father was crying because on that day, when I was sworn in, I actually saw my father, and being able to say that and do that is just, not many people get an opportunity to do it. And the fact that I was actually able to do it, it's been such a blessing. And
He must have been so proud of you.
I couldn't have been there but for everything that had happened to my father and my grandfather. But my story is really not my story. My story is 3 generations of the Gim, G-I-M family, and how I ended up here in New York City being a prosecutor. He's a completely different person because before, it was like he was fighting something. He was chasing something. You know, he was the Great Gatsby looking out onto over the pier at that green light. And now there's more of a sense of, this is life, what can I take from it? As opposed to, I must have this. So this is a new era in his life. Honestly, I'm still trying to get acclimated to it. I wasn't used to my father hugging me, now he hugs me.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very confusing, quite frankly. But he's just very warm, he gets sentimental, and you know, I'm confused because I was used to him yelling all the time. But that's the beauty of the Korean American experience, right? That out of pain and suffering, you forge just this new life, and how it shapes a Korean American in America is, it affects different people differently, like how it plays out into their lives. In my case, I think a lot of hardships we went through created some artificial hardship for me, which ended up making me able to learn resourcefulness, learn to be strong, learn to deal with adversity in ways that, you know, I just couldn't have any other way. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm so thankful for my father. I admire him and I respect him.
So this is my father, Joseb Gim, also known as Kim Gyu-bong, also known as Kim Dae-sun.
우리 이민 생활에는 사실은 힘들었지. 힘들었는데 오늘의 우리 코리안 아메리칸들은 너무 행복한 거야. 오늘 조금도 다름이 없는 미국의 시민이니까 우리가 이민 올 때는 정말 남의 나라에 온 사람 같이 그렇게 살았지. 이제는 그렇게 사는 사람 한국 사람 아무도 없어. 오면은 여기 우리나라다 이러고 사니까.